our friends from international institutions. And the thing is how MPI is being helping develop knowledge on the SDG agenda through different institutions. So it will be a very interesting approach. So I would like to invite first our friend Martin Evans yes, you're first.
This is a tough spot.
I have to tell you, I will repeat it later, that we'll have our photo taken just after the sessions. So we prepare and go and get some comment and all that. So. All right.
Thanks, Gonzalo. Hi.
You have like 6-7 minutes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've designed this to be short and sweet. Good morning, everyone. I'm Martin Evans.
You turn on.
Failed the breakfast test. So, I'm Martin Evans. I'm a research associate at OPHI. Some of you may have seen, he's been at MPPN before and he wasn't that. And that's right, I used to work at UNICEF HQ. And it's great to see that 2 years since I first joined, there's now lots of discussion on child poverty. I take no credit for that. So today I'm going to look at what I currently work on. I'm based at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute in London, and my portfolio is basically around social protection and looking at how social protection achieves poverty reduction or not. Next slide. Or shall I lean over?
No, it's all right.
I don't respect servants.
No, I'm happy to do that.
So if we're thinking about the SDGs, then poverty reduction, both multidimensional and monetary, exist in SDG Goal 1. And guess what's there alongside it? It's a number of goals and aims on social protection, particularly about basic social protection to prevent poverty. So that leads us to how we look at those two things together in aggregate and also at the country level, how you design programs of social protection to optimize poverty reduction. So there's a big question in sort of the analysis and development of policy on how those things can be aligned. So how do we coordinate and align poverty and social protection to achieve those poverty outcomes? There are also big measurement issues. If we think we can design different forms of MPIs at the national level, then that goes alongside a different way of approaching monetary poverty at the country level. And putting those two things together to design social protection systems to give you an impact on poverty reduction is an interesting area. And then we have to look to see what's happened to poverty, what's worked in terms of social protection, and how to monitor progress. So I'm going to cover those very, very briefly in outline, and also do a couple of adverts for stuff that's going on at the moment. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so poverty and social protection have big conceptual overlapping areas. Poverty is about a lack of material well-being. Some of you may shoot me down for that, but I think that's the safest approach. And that includes monetary poverty, which some countries measure using income, some countries measure using consumption at the household level, and a range of material deprivations that go into a multidimensional poverty index or can be seen separately. Social protection is also about improving income or consumption. I'm just using the dollar sign because I'm trying to make the slide small. And about related deprivations and access to services. I don't know of a single social protection system in the world other than ones that solely rely on social insurance, which also do not care about keeping kids in school, reducing fees, giving access to health services, and a wide range of other things besides just giving cash. So it's not just cash. People think of social protection as cash, but it isn't just cash. It can also be the provision of in-kind, either food or food stamps in the US, and also the provision of loans. It's about service access. It's about reducing the costs to zero or to more affordable rates, or providing insurance for access to health. And it's about ensuring that kids have the equipment and the ability to get to school and not pay fees for that. Sometimes social protection has a conditional element, particularly for social assistance. So to claim social protection, there's something that people have to do, whether it's ensure their kids are in school, whether it's taking them for health checks. Those are two common things that exist in conditional cash transfers in Latin America and elsewhere. Or whether it's about being ready to take a job and going to training and for doing those things. So we can always think of social protection providing a range of cash and services, but also trying to alter and influence and support people in their behavior to help them address their needs. Next slide. Okay. So I said earlier there are problems of measurement. And what we find when we say, okay, what impact does social protection have on poverty? Then sometimes it's very easy to measure because we have a simple bit of arithmetic that says someone used to be £1 below the poverty line, we gave them $1, sorry, I won't be English. We gave them they were $1 below the poverty line, we gave them $2, and they're now $1 above the poverty line. That's the simple arithmetic. But it rarely works that way for two reasons. There is a huge difference in the way that countries construct the way that they measure monetary welfare for households. So that means that your ability to shift poverty, when you come to the statistical impact on poverty, depends not only on what the social protection program does, but what effect it has on that indicator that you use to measure poverty. And some of the big examples we know of is that, you know, sometimes a pound to pound or a dollar to dollar doesn't occur. We know from evaluations in southern Africa, local to here, Malawians and Zimbabwe, that even the poorest families, poorest households, will not keep all that money to themselves. They will actually give money to other friends, relatives, to support them. So that dollar that you're giving that household loses a bit because it goes to someone else. Similarly, I know this isn't news, but for statistics and for measuring poverty reduction, sometimes it is, poor households tend to have debts. And paying back that debt can sometimes be the first or second call on extra income. If you're paying back a debt, it may not actually influence the way that your monetary welfare is measured for poverty. So there's that problem, the pound for pound doesn't do it. So every country will have a different manifestation of this problem. Malaysia, who are here, I've done some work in Malaysia, and we did some simulation of social pensions. And it was very easy in Malaysia because their poverty measure used to, I don't know if it still does, I've got 1 minute, use gross income. Yeah? So a dollar or a ringgit does produce a ringgit in outcome. But I was simulating cash transfers in Ghana last week, and that's not true there. The other problem is we don't know a lot about the underlying relationships between increasing household income and reductions in deprivations. For instance, if we're worried about kids being in school, the impact of $1 will be different for a kid attending primary school than it will be for an older kid who has to attend secondary school with the higher costs, both direct and indirect, of doing so. Next slide and I'm done. So, the evidence on what social protection does is getting better and better and better. There's been a huge range of high-quality evaluation evidence. I'm just going to pull out two examples, one of which a lot of multidimensional poverty indices have nutrition outcomes in them. We know from the evidence that social protection systems improve food security, so people will improve their food diversity score. They won't use crisis management of sharing meals or buying cheaper food so much. But the evidence on nutritional outcomes is much weaker. The ability to decrease stunting directly through social protection usually needs a mediating influence, such as information. And the excellent studies in Bangladesh done by John Hoddenott and colleagues speak to that. But there are also a range of outcomes on social participation. And this is where it's an advert for something I was finishing for an evaluation in Myanmar last week, where we looked at the effect of giving loans at the village level to households, and we looked to see whether they belonged to social organizations. And these social organizations included the committees and the clubs which were organizing social protection. So we're a bit worried about endogeneity. But they also included clubs like football clubs, church groups. And what we found is that the deprivation levels in a difference in difference estimation really fell significantly when we looked at their isolation from social groups. That's my time up. Next slide, we'll say goodbye. Also give you my email contact details if you want to chat, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you for the rest of today. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, Martin. So I would like now to invite Maxwell Mkumba from SADC, Senior Policy Advisor, Poverty and Development. Welcome, Maxwell. You have a presentation.
Yep, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation for a simple reason. It's the first time that we are attending this, at least in my personal capacity. And as such, I felt like I needed, first of all, to listen and understand the direction of the debate in here. But I think when I made introductions, I also explained where we are coming from, where we are, and where we want to go. So within the 7 minutes, I'll just do a recap. First of all, to say that the decision to monitor poverty at the regional level was arrived at in 2008 when the heads of state and government met in Mauritius. They came up with a declaration, and this declaration is actually based on the objectives of SADC, which, among other things, seeks to promote sustainable development, and equitable economic growth, socio-economic development that will ensure poverty eradication amongst the peoples of the region, but also enhance the standard and quality of life. This is precisely what is contained in the SADC Treaty. Now, it is important to understand that the heads of state and government had noticed that despite economic growth, poverty was still persistent. And mind you, this debate was coming at the time the world was experiencing the economic crisis in 2008, from 2008. And this actually made people more vulnerable because of surging food prices, the energy, increasing energy prices. So the situation was really terrible in most of the member states. It was therefore necessary to rethink about implementation of poverty eradication strategies within the framework of the regional plan, which is the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, as well as the plan for the organ on politics, defense, and security. Now, I just wanted to mention this, that I think yesterday was Sabina mentioned about how MPI can assist us, especially in addressing this challenge where you actually see economic growth being registered amongst the member states, but poverty reduction is happening at a very, very slow pace. And in order to do this, and when I joined the Secretariat in 2014, I actually found that there was this debate because I think in 2013, the SADC Secretariat had invited the Oxford poverty and in order just to sit down and see how best this issue of MPI can be brought on board in the work of the Regional Poverty Observatory. And I understood why it was very, very important, coming from that perspective where there was growth, but poverty reduction was not as fast as people would have expected. So it was found out that the reason MPI is necessary for SADC and why we need just to do a little more is that I think amongst most of the member states in the region, poverty has many faces. It's like an octopus. The challenges in addressing issues of poverty are there for many. Even then, adopting the World Bank International Poverty Lines in this endeavor vis-a-vis national poverty lines is a headache. Most of the poor in the region cannot be defined by measure of income alone. So we have taken the initiative to engage the Oxford in order to see how best this can be done. I'm not too sure about, because even the fact that this meeting is taking place within the region, it should have been the reason enough to see most of the member states attending this meeting. But you can see that I think there's a lot of more work to be done in order to bring them on board. So you see that I think people in the region are more worried about the health, education. They're more worried about the decent living conditions than just about the issues of income. So this is the beauty about the debate that arose through collaboration with OPHI. After all, MPI was approved by the UN, and it is our commitment that we need to move into that direction. Now, in conclusion, I'm told that there's only 1 minute left. I'm not too sure which watch you're using, but I thought that I had 3 minutes. So SADC Secretariat must work with the Oxford to develop both regional MPI. This is what I'm just proposing, and also see how we can fast track the development of the national MPI. Secondly, we want to, I think we must mobilize adequate resources. I think there was the issue about communication. And one of the things that we have noticed is that member states need to be informed about why they need to go the MPI way. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard. But not only that, not only informing, but also we need to train them. And because of that, I think we need adequate resources, because moving forward, this is the way things should be. We need to train both planners, but also statisticians in this endeavor. We must ensure that MPI and SDGs are enforcing each other. We must have a very serious discussion. I've seen UNDP. They were trying to find a way of coming to the Secretariat. We're trying to find a way of going to UNDP, you know. So I was just telling him that it's like somebody looking for a suitor. You discover that there's also, you are a man looking for a woman to marry. There's also a woman looking for a man to marry, but the two of you can't meet, you know. This is exactly what was happening with ourselves with the UNDP. So we will have to do that, and including the fact that we need to have our own regional forum. And then I think this also, I think, assists us a lot in assisting member states to undertake national voluntary reviews. Because I think by addressing the issues of MPI, you actually see that you're already addressing SDG 1, SDG 2, 3, 4, almost all the goals that would be addressed by having the MPI adopted amongst the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Maxwell, very much. Thank you very much. Now we invite Elina Scheja from Lead Economist from Sida. Welcome, Elina. Thank you very much.
Here we go. Good morning, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure for me to address this crowd here today. It's also a pleasure to contribute to the panel that otherwise would have been an all-male panel, so I make a contribution here as well. I've had the pleasure to meet many of you in Beijing last year, whereas many of the participants are new. So this presentation is to cater to a broad range of participants here and as a starter of the discussions. Could I get the first slide, please?
You want to change it or you want me to?
Yeah.
I can do it, but...
No.
Yeah? No? All right, I'll do it.
No?
I cannot put it here.
While we're waiting for the slides to appear, I would just like to know that as a Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, our goal is to contribute to improve living conditions for people who are living in poverty. We've taken this mission as a broad mission since almost 20 years back. So we've been working with multidimensional poverty in one way or the other for quite some time. Currently, our work is framed by the Sustainable Development Goals that are also multidimensional, and that also say that we should strive to, eradicate poverty in all its forms everywhere. What it doesn't tell us is what all these forms are, but leaves it up to the governments to decide how they want to define poverty in their contexts. Sida has taken that challenge to our hearts, and we're one of the first agencies who are actually explicitly taking a stand on what we mean by multidimensional poverty. And we've formed a framework that, first and foremost, is aimed to make us better at understanding what poverty is and what could be done to eradicate it in all its forms. Could I get the next slide? We're talking about the different dimensions of poverty. How Sida defines poverty is in 4 broad dimensions, starting from the perspective of the poor, which is why the WHO is in the middle and at the center of the attention. We recognize that poverty is a very personal experience, but we believe that in these 4 broad categories, it can be conceptualized and worked on. So we start with resources, which is something valuable that you own, that's vested in you. We expand that understanding with opportunities and choice, which refers to something, your ability to use your resources to lift yourself and your household out of poverty, or your ability to build your resource base. We're also talking about power and voice, which refers to your ability to influence decisions that are important to your life. And these three dimensions we've been working on for quite some time now, and they should feel familiar as they are derived from Amartya Sen's capability approach on people trying to be the best versions of themselves. Recently, we also added human security, as we felt that the other three dimensions don't really capture an important dimension of poverty, as poverty is currently concentrating into conflict-ridden and fragile states. The next, thanks. Gonzalo was, oh, thanks, now it's working. Referring yesterday that not all the development issues are poverty, and we agree. So according to our definition, a person living in poverty is resource poor and poor in one or several other dimensions. So if you're only poor in the power and voice dimension, you are deprived in those rights, but that's not necessarily poverty. So in order to be poor, you need to be resource poor, but we understand also that you can't impact the resources unless you understand the other dimensions where people are living in. So that's a aim to refocus our work on eradicating poverty. Just quickly, what we mean by resources is a lot broader than the usual definition. So for example, income, education, and health would all be in resources. So the one dimension is actually capturing the global MPI as a whole. The opportunities is mainly talking about access to employment, proactive employment, which many of you have taken as part of your MPI, and also access to healthcare and basic services. What I haven't seen that much is the dimension of discrimination, human rights, and access to power, which is also a dimension that we left. And the human security refers to psychological, sexual, and physical safety and violence that's been lifted in some of the MPIs. Not everything is relevant in all contexts and in all countries. So as we are working globally with different country contexts, we try to specify what parts of these four dimensions are relevant in a given context. So that's how we define poverty and try to define who is poor. But in order to move from measurement to action, to actually do something about it, it would be very nice to know how people ended up in this position and how could we find the pathways out of poverty. Which is why we also added an outer layer to this analytic framework. So now we're moving away from definition into analyzing the country context, able to act on our findings. And we are looking at the political and institutional context, the economic and social context, environmental context, and conflict and peaceful context that influence the situation of poverty, but that's usually beyond the control of individuals who are living in poverty. And by understanding that, we're trying to sharpen our interventions in order to get closer to people living in poverty and alleviate their perceived poverty. I will, in interest of time, skip that. What I wanted to talk to you about is the updates on where we are now. The framework was designed by last year when we met in Beijing. In January this year, we had a big launch and rolled out the concept to our country offices. And by now, I'm very happy to say that we have approximately 20 country offices who have done or are in the process of doing their own country analytics to understand multidimensional poverty in the context where they are working. We're building a critical mass around this concept, and by now the talk of multidimensional poverty has become a norm. So if a couple of years ago somebody would say, and I was surprised, so you're working on multidimensional poverty? Now the question would be, are you not working on multidimensional poverty? I mean, that's what we do. The aim is also to transfer that into a mindset and keep that as part of our standard way of doing business. So Sida has now adopted a 3-year goal of making that multidimensional poverty analytics and understanding and discourse as part of our strategy, as part of our projects, and as part of our dialogue with our partners and in the work that we are doing. In order to facilitate that work, we have recently developed a poverty toolbox that's available on our website, sida.se. If you want to know more about the framework and how we define it, that's available there. But I would like to also say that this could be a useful tool for you in whichever way you decide to define poverty, as it provides guiding questions on what poverty could imply in different contexts. And it also provides links to databases, to indicators for you to measure poverty and do some benchmarking on where you're going. So I hope that will be a useful resource for you to, in your work going forward. I'm running out of time and I'm running out of slides, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elina. Now I would like to invite Wilmot Reeves from UNDP. Welcome. Welcome, Wilmot.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. Apologies, I don't have a presentation to make because my presence here basically is about presenting the sort of policy direction of UNDP global, and not specifically the country office that I represent, Botswana and then the Swatini. I bring you, of course, greetings from our senior management in New York, HQ. As you will notice from the earlier program, our chief economist, Ayo, should have been at this program. For some reason, he couldn't come because he's engaged at the HQ level, so he basically asked us to come over to speak on behalf of UNDP, presenting our global view on the MPI and the sort of work that we intend to do going forward, working with different stakeholders. It is a known fact that since 2009, UNDP has been in the forefront trying to basically advocate for multidimensional poverty, and then as a policy tool for development management at country levels. And the sort of approach that we have basically advocated for has been the eradication of poverty in all its forms and dimensions. And this advocacy that started somehow in 2009 eventually led to the articulation and development of the NPI, which was jointly done by UNDP and OPHI. And as you are aware, before the articulation of the NPI, we used to have what we call the Human Poverty Index, which also measured deprivations, but did not look at the multidimensional aspect of poverty at the time. They looked at only the 3 dimensions through which the Human Development Index is sort of measured: education, health, longevity, and then decent standard of living. So the introduction of the NPI which basically fell into the 2010 Global Human Development Report, was considered a landmark success. So, having developed the MPI, which is now integrated into all human development reports that have been produced since 2010, UNDP has now considered the multidimensional approach to the elimination of poverty as one of the anchors of its strategic plan. UNDP recently produced its 4-year strategic plan, the global, and that is from 2018 to 2021. And poverty eradication is one of the 3 pillars articulated in the strategic plan. And then there are 6 signature solutions. And poverty eradication is the first of the 6. So, the eradication of poverty at the country level, in all its forms and dimensions, is considered a salient policy intervention for UNDP, and it is expected to form the basis of our work on the SDGs at the global, at the regional, and at the national levels. So what we intend to do as a global development organization is to make sure we promote the eradication of poverty in program countries. But then to do so, we have to work through national institutions, governments, and then other partners on the ground. So one of the policy directions that we have taken is a promotion of national ownership on the MPI. As such, UNDP is presently working at the country level to advocate for the MPI as a holistic development approach for addressing poverty and inequality. To this effect, we are developing at a global level a framework that will help countries to domesticate the MPI into various development planning processes, including surveys that are being held within countries, household income and expenditures surveys, for example. And then what we have also decided to do from the global level, as you are aware, we do have the presence of economists in various countries. So a policy decision has been taken by UNDP to ensure that the MPI is sort of incorporated in the job descriptions of all senior economists in the field to work as they work with program countries. They are to basically advocate that the MPI is sort of mainstreamed into the development processes of countries so that we take that sort of multidimensional approach to the eradication of poverty. And then lastly, before I'm giving the axe to move, the issue of data has also been recognized as being very critical. And I think from the discussions we've held so far, we've all said that in the absence of data, there is no way we can talk about the MPI. And I think that is somewhat manifested in this year's report, where some countries were not, the MPI was not calculated for some countries because of the lack of data. And I think, so as part of our responsibility as a development organization is also to be part of the data revolution. Alliances, as being part of our effort to advocate for the inclusion of NPI into data revolution framework, with a view to expanding awareness, the utility of NPI, and for a region-wide adoption of the NPI in different planning processes. How do we intend to do this? Lastly, forging strategic partnerships will be quite important. We want to be able to work with regional bodies, like SADC, like ECOWAS, like the EAC, civil society organizations, government, of course, leading the way, and then academia, and all our partners, including OPHI, the World Bank, and others that are presently working on this development approach. So we will be, our partnership with OPHI is highly recognized and will continue for a long time to come on the NPI in all our work that we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'd like to invite Russel Wildeman from UNICEF. He's a social policy specialist. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to this wonderful audience. It's always a pleasure. The invitation got to me in an accidental manner. It was actually extended to the ED, and then she chose one of the foot soldiers basically to come and represent the organization. I'm not going to say much about the process which is presently unfolding between us and Stat South Africa. We're presently piloting the multiple overlapping deprivation analysis, or MODA, as this seems to be the local flavor in Southern and Eastern Africa. So I'm not going to speak much about that, but rather reflect on some of the sort of emerging evidence in this particular region about multiple dimensional poverty, specifically related to children, basically. Because I think the argument has been won quite successfully within the SDGs that you need to measure poverty in all its dimensions, basically. So there isn't any resistance from the organization itself. But just a couple of interesting observations. Since 2016, 13 of the 21 officers in the Eastern and Southern African region have done some multidimensional poverty report, basically, or invested in some multidimensional study. Now, of course, some of these analyses are dated, and some of these need to be updated. South Africa is one classic example. We've last done, I think, a report in 2009, and there's a need for us to update the information, basically. But just some of the interesting statistics. 3 out of 5 children in the region are considered to be multidimensionally poor, and that range from about 4 out of 10 kids in Rwanda to about 9 out of 10 children in Tanzania. Also, interestingly, about 66% of children which are considered multidimensionally poor are located in the rural areas, and approximately 38% of these children are located in urban areas, basically. So you can quite clearly see there is a rural bias in terms of the multidimensional poverty statistics. Interestingly enough, in terms of the sample of 17 countries that were looked at, multidimensional poverty seems to be much higher than monetary poverty for most of the countries. It's about 15% higher than the monetary estimates of poverty, basically. Of course, there are some reversals. South Africa, Zambia, Rwanda, Eswatini, and are some of the examples where the opposite actually applies, where monetary poverty is substantially higher than multidimensional poverty. So just a couple of issues that we are finding across the region in terms of the way that multidimensional poverty studies are being done. The one is obviously the selection of cutoff points. And there's a tendency within the region basically to make the cutoff points as less rigorous as possible. Because there's obviously political incentives. So if you are able to specify a cutoff point where if somebody is poor in 3 or 4 dimensions, your multidimensional poverty rate is going to be extremely low. So that's one of the challenges which is being addressed at this point in time. And it's a worrying trend, I think, across. And this is, of course, an issue that UNICEF South Africa and STAT South Africa will have to confront when we have to come to these determinations, hopefully in this year, 2018. The other issue is that this low figure of multidimensional poverty then sends the wrong message to policymakers, basically. It says to policymakers, if the issue is around monetary poverty, simply boost incomes from a market point of view, instead of actually investing in social services, basically. So that's a key issue. I don't know how this can be resolved, because if your country is under political pressure to produce results which are satisfactory or okay, and I was really impressed by what you said yesterday about the ability to find consensus, because to find consensus in Southern and Eastern Africa is not an easy issue. And politically, it's very, very challenging to do so, basically. So how that will be resolved is a critical matter, because if you keep on producing low multidimensional poverty estimates, you're actually masking the problem, and you're not in a position to sort the key underlying issues. Another thing that we find with the multidimensional reports is that people focus on too many age groups, so that the bigger picture is lost. There is merit when people speak about the life cycle approach and the fact that kids in different stages of their life requires different things, but the overall picture often is blurred, and it doesn't come out clearly when you have so many different age determinations or age group focus and so on. So maybe just to step away from that and just to sort of conclude on the process with STAT South Africa. Obviously, STAT South Africa is the leading agency. They will be doing the multidimensional report, and STAT South Africa is still invested in the MPI. The MPI process and our MODA process are two different processes, but I mean, that's partly the reason why I was motivated to come here, to learn about the MPI and how multidimensional poverty is measured differently in different contexts and so on and so on. But the process is a very simple one. STAT South Africa is the lead agency. They will basically publish the report. We are in the process of actually undergoing the training. If I'm not mistaken, the training will be completed in November 2018, and hopefully next year, I think first or second quarter, STAT South Africa will actually release a report. The only issue that I want to raise, it's not really an issue, but it's an issue of, again, coming back to the presentation by Mexico yesterday, how do you consult in a way that's meaningful? How do you bring together all cross-sections of departments, and how do you ensure that people who sit around the table are the right people? Because once you take a decision about how you're going to measure child poverty, it's a fairly solid decision, basically. And then you don't want to have a situation where some senior people in a department disavow whatever measurement approach has been taken and so on. So the quality of the work that we will be doing is in part going to be reflected by how well this tool is accepted by everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Russell. And I would like to invite Javier Mancero from CEPAL, ECLAC, Latin America. Thank you. Let me just try to do it. Carry on and then. No.
Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure being here and having the opportunity to address this audience. When preparing this very short presentation that I will make, I was thinking ECLAC has been present in several of the MPPN meetings, and we have had already the opportunity to present the work we have been doing. So this presentation will be just an update of what is the most recent activities we've been undertaking, instead of a description of the whole work and approach to the measurement of poverty. So our focus since last year, I would say, has been on how to improve the measurement of the different indicators of the different variables that usually are used when building a multidimensional poverty index with household surveys. This comes as when we were Well, I will tell that we did a comparable MPI for the region, and also we have analyzed the different MPIs that have been produced in Latin America. And one thing that we noticed is that in many cases, even though there are dimensions of welfare that are well known and have been measured for a while, the quality of the measurement, the comparability of the measurement is not always high, it's not always possible to compare across them. So the idea was to identify what is the best way to measure these dimensions. Since last year, we have been implementing a program on statistics and data to support the measurement of SDGs with 10 UN entities. And for this particular aspect of poverty measurement, we had a joint initiative with the other UN regional commissions from Western Asia, Western Africa, Asian Pacific, and Europe. And the idea was to prepare several studies on this issue of the comparability of non-monetary indicators, their quality, their availability across different regions. So one of these products is already finished. It will be published soon. It's just been formatted. And there's also a publication on the challenges in designing national multidimensional poverty measures coming from this joint initiative. And other aspect of the work we have been doing together with one of the NSOs from Latin America, Fredane, Colombia, as they are the coordinators of one of the working groups of the Statistical Conference of the Americas, the working group on poverty measurement, where we are trying to identify the current practices in the measurement of, let's say, non-traditional dimensions of poverty. So quality of employment, empowerment, physical security, subjective welfare, etc. Some of which, it has been already discussed, may or may not be part of a multidimensional poverty index. But nevertheless, we want to focus on how these dimensions are being measured with household surveys and how can we improve those measurements. And well, in 2019, we will have a regional seminar to discuss all these findings with countries of the region. And then is another aspect which has to do with the analysis of regional trends and trying to have a comparable focus with countries. ECLAC has a long history of making poverty measurements in the monetary realm. And also in 2014, we published a study with a regional comparable measure for Latin America. That particular measure adopted several, took some decisions that were subject to a lot of debate. One of them was the inclusion of income poverty as one of its indicators. Another one was the inclusion of a dimension of employment on social protection, which was assigned a lower weight than the other ones. And at that time, 4 years ago, it was not so common to have these kind of indicators within an MPI. And well, there are the references. The study itself is the Social Panorama in 2014, but there's also a OPHI working paper and a Review of Income and Wealth paper that describes all the details of this index. So we have a revision planned for next year, and we hope that this will be an opportunity to discuss again some issues that have not a clear answer, a clear-cut answer, such as if, for example, income should be included within an MPI or not. There are arguments in favor and against that. Also, this idea of to what extent are we talking about poverty, or are we mixing it with other concepts, social exclusion or other well-being approaches in general? So it's a good opportunity to have this discussion. And also something that has been discussed here about if to have a general MPI with the best group-specific indicators possible, or is it necessary to also have group-specific MPIs, such as children and other groups of population, as was discussed yesterday. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. You have another 3 minutes more, but then you're very generous. I would like to invite Khalid Abu-Ismail, who is the Chief of Economic Policy section in the Arab countries. Welcome.
Morning. Well, I suppose now that we have a surplus of 3 minutes, that's a good thing.
We had a deficit at the beginning.
Oh, we did? Okay. I thought I'd give it a shot. Okay, so what I'd like to do here basically is discuss 3 things. First, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes discussing the Arab Poverty Report, which we did with OPHI last year, and then just go over some of the main findings of that report before closing with some current and future plans. So the first question is, why would you want to have a regional report, a regional MPI report? And throughout our discussions with the Arab countries, and starting in 2012, we noticed that there was an interest, there was a genuine interest in multidimensional poverty. But Arab countries, middle-income countries in particular, were just concerned that this was not useful for policy purposes because it showed very little deprivation, less than 5% actually in many of the middle-income countries. So while there was that demand, there was a need to develop this index. And so basically we, at ESCWA, in partnership with OPHI, UNICEF, and under the umbrella of League of Arab States, started a series of consultations in order to come up with this regional MPI. Now that took a long process, almost 3 years of work, a lot of consultations at the regional level, a lot of experts. It was certainly not easy by any means. More than, I think, like 4 EGMs, 200 experts from the region. So it is actually a difficult, lengthy process in order for you to reach that kind of consensus. Finally, we presented this new proposal at the League of Arab States Ministerial Council, and it was endorsed. Now that was very important for us to get this ministerial approval, because as one of the previous speakers said, you need to have that endorsement at the highest level in order for you to get the national ownership and commitment to the results. Okay, so basically the Arab MPI is an extension of the global MPI. The idea is basically that we would start with the global MPI, that we would adjust it in 2 manners. First, by adding new indicators, 2 new indicators that we thought were relevant for the region, such as the female genital mutilation, early pregnancy, and the overcrowding. Again, that came out of the discussions that we had in the regions. We thought those 2 specific indicators were important to include. And the other aspect that we adjusted was the threshold. For example, in education, the definition for deprivation was adjusted from a household having no one was achieved less than secondary education as a deprivation cutoff. And that led to this picture that you see here, which is basically an average deprivation of around 40% in the region. Almost double what the global MPI report has come out with last year for the Arab region. But you can also see that the countries were grouped into 3 clusters, where you have countries like Jordan, Algeria, Tunis, and Egypt in one cluster, Morocco and Iraq in another cluster, and then you have the LDCs. You can also see that we have also computed an acute MPI, which is similar in a way to the global one. And the results of that were relatively similar to the global MPI. Importantly, and this is an important issue to take into account, the situation has changed a lot since we've published that report. And for many countries, today, if we were to actually go and to rely on more recent surveys, I think the situation would be a lot more dire. Take, for example, the case of Syria. Syria wasn't included actually in the regional report, but if you look at Syria today, what we expect is that it's moved up tremendously, just basically out of our own ESCWA calculations as a result of conflict. Yemen, again, we expect the situation would have deteriorated significantly. In terms of the contributions of deprivation, education was found to be the highest single contributor to poverty, and this is expected, given what we know about the region. We've also found that 1/4 of the population was vulnerable to poverty, and that had also significant implications on the narrative, because basically then, if you add it to the 40%, what that says is that almost 2/3 of the Arab population was either poor or vulnerable to poverty. What next? Briefly, just going over a couple of initiatives we have with, in terms of pushing the agenda on inequality using the same data sets. We've decided with the ERF to go into a couple of indicators. Here's the education. You can see the years of schooling, there's been a lot of improvement region-wide, but still a lot of gaps at the urban-rural level. You can see that even though there's been improvement, you can see there are a lot of significant rural-urban gaps. Also, in terms of wealth inequality, we're looking here at the gaps by wealth. You can see that there's been a lot of deterioration in terms of the ratio of the richest to poorest quintiles over time, and specifically for Iraq and Comoros and Yemen. And so basically, what we'd like to do is use this data in order for us to push the multidimensional poverty agenda further, working with the League of Arab States and OPHI on the next Arab Poverty Report is an important milestone, and also to contribute to the examination of subnational disparities also using the MPI. That's it, basically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid. I wonder if Ali is around. All right, we said about Ali, but we're lucky that we have more time. And therefore, we have up until 10:40 to have questions and answers, and we can have possibility for speakers to speak a little bit more. So I wonder if Maxwell is around. Maxwell, are you here? All right. So, okay. So we had a great session, I believe, where Martin told us about the relationship between MPI and social protection. Maxwell reminded us the importance of using MPI, because if we use that, we already are using some of the SDGs elements. Elina reminded us of the various dimensions in Sida. Wilmot, of course, reminded us of the relationship between OPHI and UNDP for the MPI, so we are happy for that partnership. Russel, it was important that he reminded us about the importance of cutoffs and agreements. Javier and Khalid gave us an overview of the update they are doing, both in Latin America and the Arab countries, especially interesting how the Arab countries tailor their own MPI for the region. So with that in mind, I can open the floor to questions and some answers. Please.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the panelists for the quality of the presentation.
Russell, sorry, is Russell here? Okay, yes, please come. Do you want to come? Yes.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay. Well, congratulate the panelists for the quality of the presentation. My first concern is about is for Evan. In Angola, government starts to have a social protection with the money transfer for some localities. And now they ask the National Statistics Office to evaluate the impact. The concern is that this money transfer is located in some communes or some regions. And to do that, it is necessary to do a survey. We are doing a big survey, but the problem is that some of those localities are not part of the sample. So I don't know how we can, if you have some experience on it, how we can deal with this situation if we have to do little surveys where this kind of action is taken. So this is the first question. The second one is about UNDP at country level. I think you have a big role to play in our countries, because the feeling is that when the international organization come with some innovation, the government is always willing to see and to follow. And I think this is an opportunity now to UNDP with OPHI to really push this kind of issue for our country, because the poverty is not monetary, as we are seeing here, and I think this is a very important opportunity for UNDP with our countries. And the last one is the quality of the data. The last two colleagues here mentioned that, and my concern is we are comparing countries, and the last exercise for me it was a little bit surprised, because we compare countries with different realities, and perhaps we are bringing some reality that is not the reality. Sorry for the expression. So my concern is how we can really take the MPI as a tool to compare countries when we select some dimension that perhaps are not the priority in the countries. I don't know if you what I mean. So this is my big concern, because we saw here, I think it was in Vietnam, that we had data from surveys and data for administrative data. What is the quality? How we can merge them? So there are a lot of concern about the data quality that we have to reflect and we have to think about. Thank you. Sorry, my English.
No, thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much, and let me also precede my interventions by appreciating the presentations, and also emphasize that I strongly believe that there is a critical role that all these institutions can play. I have a few questions, and I'll try and keep them very short. The first one is directed to, say, SADC. I could hear the gentleman emphasizing, yes, there is poverty, yes, we know there is poverty, but then, and he's saying the initiatives to address poverty have not been yielding any results. What I expected to be hearing from him as somebody with an oversight role is why, so that then they can advise us as countries as to what we should do. The second question is directed to all the development partners. I seem to be seeing a race or competing to come up with indicators, where in some cases you find one institution will just literally be cancelling some parameters to come up with a different tool. What's the race about? When will you also consolidate yourselves to be able to meaningfully help countries. We are desperate for that advice. I'm saying this because if you look at now the MPI, then you look into what was recently released by the World Bank. In certain cases, it was just cancelling some parameters. One would be wanting to see Sida, UN, whosoever, working with common parameters. And that way it reduces the pressure on us to be chasing so many other things. The last one is, I'll take it more to the UNDP side. And my comment will go along what my colleague has just said from Angola. I think what we need to be seeing going forward, not a statement that we would have had 50 years back that says we are going to be building strategic partners. You are best placed to be able to do the strategic partners, so that what we should be getting now is it should be reaping from the benefits of the strategic partnership, not a statement that says that are still committing to say we'll be building strategic partners. You'll bear with me, I like being honest because I believe in being honest, we can forge working relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last question for this part, please.
Thank you, colleagues. I think for me, my comments are related to the presentation by Sida. I think the first one that was critical at Hernadez is the issue of resources in the diagram that she was using. And for me, coming from the community development space, and she was saying that the ability of communities to use to identify their own resources within communities for their own development and all that. I think for me that is very critical instead, because for us who are using the approach that we call the ABCD, asset-based community development, that says because at the moment we are focusing on what is government doing and intervening. We are not looking at how do we empower communities in terms of recognizes the powers and the resources that they have to be their own leaders in terms of their own development. So we are looking at us as government intervening, but I'm seeing the lack of saying how do we really empower communities to be the leaders in their own development. Secondly is that she also spoke, related to that is access to power. And what do we mean by that? In our own community development, we understand what it means, but it might mean different things for different people. And it creates challenges for governments. Because for us, it means that we have to do work with the people, not for the people. For us, that's what access to power means. To empower them to be able to lead their own development and their own process. So you work with them, so that the power they have. So therefore, that's the process of social mobilization. But that's what governments fear. For example, when we work in the Western Cape, we cannot use the term social mobilization or community mobilization because it has political connotations. They don't want anything that says to the world, they'll never work with you when you say you want to mobilize communities, social mobilization. So those are the things that when you talk about, for me, is the definition and understand what you would really mean by access to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panel, are you ready? One could try, give a go.
Hi, I'll answer the question on the Angolan social assistance evaluation. The answer to the question is yes, you can evaluate if you have a survey which covers your communities that received the program alongside representative communities that didn't. But it needs thinking through, and I'm not sure what stage you're at, but the earlier you think about what you want to evaluate and why from that program, and then look to see what to put in those surveys and what to supplement those surveys with, the better. But let's have a chat over coffee.
Thank you, and thank you for great great questions. I really appreciate us being able to have that kind of frank discussion. And I'd like to address the question of the race to come up with indicators, because I can identify with your concern. And I agree that we have work to do to eradicate poverty in all its forms. We shouldn't get crippled by the definition debates. The reason why Sida developed its own definition, that was mainly for internal reasons. The world has changed from having poor people living in poor countries into having a multidimensional world where the business that we were doing before was no longer delivering the results. And we felt that we needed to get better at understanding the links between what we are doing and poverty reduction. So it was mainly to sharpen our poverty focus. Also, it's not always that our partners have models ready, but there's actually quite a strong demand for these type of frameworks to help them to structure their thinking. There was a colleague at this UN World Bank conference I was attending who was just like, so what is this multidimensional poverty? Just tell me, I will deliver it, but I don't get any help in defining it. So the framework that we've developed is not something that we are imposing on our partners. It is something that helps us to understand poverty in situations we're working in, and we would be delighted to have that discussion with our partners. And the point is we have this slogan, make the model work for you. So again, how it looks like in your country context is not the same as what it looked like in the neighboring country. So the aim is to actually walk the talk and make it useful rather than compete on the indicators as such. That's secondary, and we're not offended if you have other views, but we would like to have that discussion with our partners. When it comes to the defining your resource base, that's I'm happy that you noted that point, because that's the essence of it, to focus on the things that matter for people who are living in poverty. It might not be what we thought in the beginning would be the most important ones. And if we want to make a change in people's lives, we should get our priorities straight. While I said that the model begins from the perspectives of the poor and putting them in the center of the model, talks to the agency of people living in poverty, not as objects, but as agents of change, and who are able and willing to lift themselves out of poverty if some constraints are removed. So yes, I sympathize and just underline the fact that even the resources can be context specific. When it comes to power, however, there is also some normative judgments that we use. So even in some, for example, gender equality is not a universal norm. And even if a certain society would not hold that norm close to their heart, that would still be something that we would include in the definition of poverty. So I've noted the fact that out of all these dimensions, it's the power dimension that not very many national MPIs have included in their national definitions. And it could have something to do with the reasons that you're mentioning. But I would wish that further governments and further countries and further entities who are defining their multidimensional poverty would take this into account, because in all the country analytics that we've done, there are very strong links between power and your opportunities to get employment and your resource base. So ignoring that dimension, I think, is leaving out a very important part of the puzzle. So that's why we would like to strongly advocate in having it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Elina. Anyone else from the panel? Javier?
No, thank you. I just wanted to, given the questions, comment a bit on the issue that was raised on how comparable can these measures be if reality is different across countries. And I think that's true. It's very different. It's very difficult to find a standard that will be representative for every country, if not impossible. But nevertheless, you will always have the need to see, okay, but how are things moving on or not? And you have to set for a standard that tries to represent countries and try to make them comparable. So in that sense, and from the regional perspective, we find it useful to have this kind of comparative look at countries and see which elements are common in their trends and also in which aspects of policies do work or do not work. And in trying to define this comparability, we have to sacrifice some issues so that they can be useful for every country, not necessarily for all of them at the same time. Within the Latin American region, that is an issue because you have countries that have very low levels of poverty and others that have very high levels of poverty. So even the type of the characteristics of poverty are not the same. But nevertheless, it is useful to have this aggregate view and find the common challenges. And well, I link it to the second question on why have so many different indicators. And I would say that at some point, and also from our perspective, it is because it is useful for different means. When you want to do certain types of analysis, for example, see the elements related to multidimensional poverty, you will need access to certain kind of data. You will need the possibility to do some analysis, simulations, etc. And access to data is different across different regions. So if you go at the world level, you will have certain limitations. When you go narrower to country level, you have more possibilities because you have access to more data, etc. Thank you.
Gracias, Javier. Please.
Let me say a big thank you to colleagues basically and ask questions and raised very important issues concerning how UNDP can work at the program country level, and then the issue of the partnership that was basically raised by my colleague. I certainly couldn't agree with you more on the sort of role that we can play to be able to support program countries on the ground. Like I said during my presentation, we do have the presence of economists in most of the countries that we worked in, including Angola. We do have a senior economist basically posted in Angola. And then many of the countries, I think some of the economies are kind of based on the based on the presence of a regional body. We do have a sort of one economist trying to cover certain countries. So what at the UNDP level, our corporate body is trying to do is to ensure that one of the key responsibilities of these economies will also be to make sure the issue advocating for the MPI, working with the government, because here again I mentioned the issue of the national ownership question. It is a process that has to be basically driven and then led by government, and then from outside as development partners, the UNDP or OPHI is to provide the sort of technical support that you will need. So, but, and then you may also be aware of the fact that whatever we are doing in program countries are basically aligned to the development priorities of countries. So where we see there are shortcomings is to raise these shortcomings. Let's take, for example, if there's a need, we see that multi-poverty, the multi-dimensional poverty is not a sort of a framework that is being prioritized at the country level. It is the approach that we are now taking in partnership with OPHI is to basically advocate for that is made part of the development and management process in that country. So certainly so, we will be, like I said, a framework is now being developed to ensure that the MPI is sort of domesticated in all program countries where we do have presence. And in terms of the partnership aspect that my brother talked about, forging that we are better placed, I also couldn't agree more with that. But then again, the role of government is quite important in providing the sort of direction, the level of let's say direction, the ownership that is required, because here you have different partners working in different countries. The issue of how do we coordinate our efforts will highly depend on government providing that sort of direction for us. Certainly so, where I want to believe in many of our program countries, there's that sort of collaboration. Like take, for example, in Botswana now, we do have a very strong partnership with the World Bank. And to the fact that the World Bank sits in the UN country team meetings, and so whatever is discussed there. So it's something that we can continue to institutionalize across our different program countries and things there. Well, consolidating the efforts, I think it kind of comes around the same question of how do we collectively harmonize our different approaches with what government is doing on the ground. And I think it's something that the leadership of government could be quite important toward that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilmot. Russel, please.
I often sort of approach these issues from a public finance point of view. So in the public finance cycle, you have to put forward convincing arguments for why a government has to do X or Y. And it seems to me that a big part of the success of this kind of work is dependent on advocacy that's way beyond measurement. It's not even technical. It is this idea that you convince the policymakers, not just one policymaker or a central policymaker, but all policymakers are of the necessity of this particular intervention. And until such time that you do this, you will be able to produce a tool, you will be able to have a set of results, but those results won't necessarily feed into the planning and strategic processes of that country. And I think there's a big push to get to that stage where where your tool matters, where it's not simply a question of having done technically excellent work, but nobody's really taking it seriously. And I think the next stage to get your work inserted into the formal public finance processes is a tremendous amount of advocacy work that needs to be done. So while us technicians are happy to talk about data and the algorithms and the programming routines and how to measure X and Y, for many of us, and I've seen this across the Southern and Eastern African region, we have these tools, but they are marginal in terms of the decision-making process. And we need to up our game in order to get them recognized for what they actually are as key to the decision-making process of each of these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Russel. Khalid?
Yeah, I basically want to echo what my colleague just said. The challenge is not to produce indicators. That's the easy part. It took us almost maybe a few weeks to come up with a proposal, a couple of technical meetings, a background paper, some robustness checks, etc. And we had a proposal. It took 3 years of work to build consensus around that proposal. And even after the 3 years were over, there was still a lot of resistance, even within the building where I work. So, and this is this is the challenge really, is to convince others that the value of this indicator that can be used in policy making. And that's why when we thought about the structure of our work in the division, and we made sure to have 3 things work together: the poverty measurement, the fiscal policy unit, and the employment and decent work unit. because the three of them have to talk to each other, and whatever indicators they come up with, whatever narrative they come up with, whatever approach to decision makers, whatever policy proposal has to be consistent. And the challenge, therefore, is not for you to have the set of indicators, is how do you sell the indicator to the policymaker, and then work with the policymaker in order to integrate it into the planning and budgeting process. We were, I think, successful in that effort that we had with UNICEF and OPHI, in that right after we published this report, we received many more requests for national, helping the countries with building their national poverty agendas. And I think that's the measure of success. So now the challenge is to repeat what we did at the regional level, which was intended to get this outcome, to repeat it at the national level.
Excellent, excellent presentations. We are almost on time. Thank you very much. I just want to end with the thoughts by Khalid and Russel. My first teacher of evaluation from the World Bank told me a very important phrase. He said, building a monitoring and evaluation and measurement system is a political challenge with technical elements, not the other way around. So we have to keep that in mind, and you help us to do that. Thank you very much to the panel.
Just a quick announcement before we break. It's time for a group picture. So I hope you're very excited and you're wearing your best smile, because we're going to go for the group picture now. So we're going to go, can I have everybody's attention, please? We are going to take the group picture. Please, we're going to leave the room and go outside to your right. So follow KG. KG is there. In that corner, follow him. It's just going to be outside this building, exiting the room on the right. So let's